Morning Warsaw. Today is Monday, 14th of August. It will be cloudy with sunny spells with highs of 17 degrees Celsius or 62 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 5:33 a.m. and sunset at 8:20 p.m. We are on the 14th day of the Warsaw Uprising. Today, the insurgents captured the Grey Wolf. But don't worry, we will explain what that is a little later. But Alina, tell us, what is going on the ground?
Thanks for that intro, Philippe. I'm sure that Roger is definitely going to be taking over the beginning of this one, so he's going to tell us what's happening on the ground.
Germans are concentrating a lot of their attacks on the old town of Warsaw, which is where the Home Army headquarters is located. So there's a lot of the barricades are being fought over and changing hands, and quite fierce fighting in that area. The Home Army headquarters is actually cut off at one point. They do later resolve that, but it's sort of testament to how fierce the fighting was in that area.
That's true. It doesn't go away very quickly or very easily. But the other thing we have are airdrops. And Claire, tell us a little bit about what's going on there.
Yeah, there are a lot of airdrops of supplies, both on the night of the 13th, 14th of August and on the following night as well. So, these are being carried out by the airmen of the Polish group 1586, the RAF 148 and 178, and the South African Airforce 31 and 34 squadrons. And I think on the nights of the 12th and 13th and the 13th, 14th overnight, there's a total of 54 aircraft taking off. So that's almost 30 aircraft dropping their loads. But it's not all successful. So about a third of those miss their target drop points, aren't collected by the insurgents. 20 of the aircraft miss Warsaw altogether. And all of the aircraft coming back do sustain serious damage. 11 of them were lost, and of those there were very few survivors. So to give a few examples of that, on the night of the 14th and 15th, there's a Liberator from the South African squadron, which crashes near Warsaw, and 3 of the 5 crew members are killed. They were led by Captain Jacek von Essen, and the survivors were interned by the Soviet authorities and sent to Moscow. And eventually they were handed over to the British authorities in Tehran. I think there was later a memorial erected to them in 1977. And there's some great testimony from this from the forward gunner in the South African Airforce in that aircraft, Alan Bates. Roger, have you got that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting account actually, because he writes actually about a lot of the sort of mechanics of precisely how they did what they did, and I thought it was quite interesting. The excerpt I've got, it talks about the canisters of supplies that they used and describes them, and he says these canisters of supplies contained arms, food, and medical supplies, mainly arms. He says. Long canisters about 5 or 6 feet long, and they looked like bombs, except they were blunt at both ends. In fact, some of the canisters had shovels strapped to the outside as well. Mixed supplies, they called them, but mainly weapons. I knew there were Sten guns and lots of ammunition, medical supplies. I'm not sure if there was anything in the way of food, but there may have been, but I don't think so. We didn't see into the supplies. They were loaded into the airplane by the armourers. All we did was to go to the aircraft and drop them. So we weren't really concerned with what was inside of them. But from what I heard afterwards, we assumed it was mostly arms. And there's a wonderful, just to close out his account, they dropped their supplies over Warsaw, and he talks about heading back southwest. And they were actually tailed by a German aircraft, a Junkers 88, and neither attacked the other. They just sort of tailed them as they went. And he says eventually they said, "Why don't you flash your lamp at him and tell him to go away?" And then he says, so he did. The message began with an F. He did go away. We never saw him again. I rather like that.
Just brilliant. They've got that sense of humour still.
Yeah, exactly.
Really, when you think what they are going into. My father-in-law was called Mel Rolfe, and he was a journalist, and he ended up being an author of Second World War books because he interviewed hundreds, possibly thousands of veteran navigators, pilots and other aircrew, and wrote a series of books. One of them is called Hell on Earth, and that included various of the aircrew who were flying over to drop supplies over Warsaw. And he talks about, it's called Hell on Earth because they are really firing into the teeth of enemy gunners to a city that's already in flames, and that that Alan Bates had that sense of humour on the way back is really extraordinary. But he talks about pilots who say they were flying so low that the flames seemed to be reaching higher than the aircraft just as they came in. And yet a lot of these pilots were desperate to do more, particularly the Polish squadrons, who were begging to fly more. One of them apparently even telegrammed the Queen, so the mother of Queen Elizabeth II, begging to let them provide more support. And eventually it was decided that the losses were just too extreme. I think there was about one bomber lost for every ton of supplies being delivered. And the Polish special duty squadrons alone, they lost 16 crews. So appalling losses. Perkins, who was the head of SOE's sort of Baltic section, he told Gubbins, the head of SOE altogether, "We must put aside heroics and the honour and glory of the Polish crews dying for their capital, for Warsaw cannot be rationally sustained in this manner." And even Bol Komorowski, the commander of the Home Army, he said, the fighting city thanks the heroic airmen and sends them her highest appreciation. We bow with deepest reverence before the fallen crews. But in his own memoirs written later after the war, he admitted that the help they brought us was too small to be of practical value.
I think this would be a great spot to be able to hear a little bit more from Alan Bates, because I find his testimony so fascinating. It's so long that we just had to cut some of it down. And this is what he remembers as he was flying over Warsaw and after he'd done his drop.
Well, the only personal involvement was, of course, flying on the trip. We had all gathered together quickly one morning and were told we had to fly to Brindisi. They didn't tell us what it was all about, so we hopped into the aircraft about midday and flew down there. We were briefed to go to Warsaw, and they told us all about the uprising. We didn't take much notice of news in the squadron. We had probably heard the Warsaw Uprising had happened. We probably had. There was a Pole there who gave us quite a detailed talk on it, and he got us all going, as a matter of fact. We were quite upset for the partisans there. He was so emotional about his town and his compatriots and the situation they were in, and they'd got to get help. I don't think he could have stopped anyone from going. The only trouble was he said it was a piece of cake, and it wasn't. You see, they'd been there the night before, and they had all got back again quite happily. But that was the night before, and this was another night, and they were waiting for us. The night after us was worse still. They really knew what was happening. We went over Yugoslavia, over Hungary, getting a good point on the Danube, over the Carpathians, missed out Vienna if you could help it, and missed out Krakow. We went in between Tarnów and Krakow, then hit the Vistula and find your way. You could see Warsaw from 30 miles away, burning. It was sort of a general smudgy, mainly smoke, lots of smoke and occasional smudgy flames coming out. But most of the city was burning in places. I didn't know what to expect really. I was a bit naive in those days. Just used to go and think, isn't that funny? What's it burning for? I think we did expect something like that. I hadn't been over a particular battle area before. We had to go in at about 400 feet, which is about the height of the post office tower, a little bit higher than that, and we had to throttle back and put the flaps down to reduce speed so the parachutes wouldn't tear off the canisters. We were supposed to drop it in Krasinski Square, but I'm afraid I didn't find it. I dropped it somewhere nearby. We got caught in the searchlights as soon as we came in. We more or less came in over the airport, which was the wrong thing to do, because they're well defended, their airfields. Somebody got caught in the light, so we thought we should nip in quickly, but of course they burst into flames and disappeared, and the lights quickly switched straight onto us. So we crept across the target, and it must have been about 2 minutes, and you could see people firing at you. You could see people sitting with a machine gun firing at you from the roof, having a go at you. But mainly it was just a mass of tracer bullets coming straight up, and I was sitting in the nose and had to turn around a few times. How we weren't shot to bits, I don't know. We lost an engine and the hydraulics went. We climbed out once we had dropped our supplies to about 5,000 or 6,000 feet, and then the aircraft just shuddered and suddenly stalled and dived to starboard, and it really did dive. The G-force for me in the nose, I got stuck on the ceiling, and there was nothing I could do about it. I was stuck to the ceiling looking down, and I could see Warsaw coming back at me. Later on, the second pilot pulled the aircraft out, and the G-force was the opposite, and I was stuck on the floor, and I couldn't get off the floor if I wanted to. My eyeballs were almost popping out.
I just love Alan. He's so articulate with his words. Absolutely brilliant. But Claire, you're going to continue, and we might as well continue on the subject of airdrops. Are there any losses on this day?
There were huge losses. So we had the South African loss that I mentioned earlier. And also there were Polish losses. There was a Polish Liberator that was shot down on returning, having made its drop over Warsaw. That was a 7-person crew under pilot Captain Zbigniew Żostak and the navigator Stanisław Daniel. And they were posthumously awarded the Virtuti Militari. Zbigniew, the commentary on it was given in recognition of his personal courage demonstrated while performing special flights to Poland. He was a role model and an outstanding combat pilot. So yes, these fallen pilots, they were buried in a cemetery in Krakow after the war. There's another Liberator which crashed down after delivering a drop of supplies in an area of Warsaw, and the bodies of the 6 fallen crew members were later recovered. They were taken to a local sacristy and then buried in a common grave in a square adjacent to the church. And we have details of that from the notes of the diary of the captain of the aircraft. So we have all these personal stories that tell, but collectively it builds up to a huge and appalling level of losses. So appalling losses at this point, and I think there's this general census of people disassociating in a way. The Allies are very concerned. They are reducing the number of flights that can go over because of the number of losses. They think it's unsustainable. And on the Soviet side, it's quite interesting there as well. There's a quote from the Russian correspondent in the Times, isn't there, who's reporting from Moscow?
Yes, indeed. 13th of August 1944, the Times' correspondent in Moscow writes that the TASS agency, i.e. the Soviet news agency, states that it is authorized to dispel rumors which it describes as having originated in Polish circles in London, that the Red Army had anything to do with the Warsaw Rising. An article published here this morning points out that the leaders of the revolt were at no time in contact with the Russian command, and that any suggestions to this effect were either based on misinformation or were intended to slander the Russian command. Russian plans for the liberation of Warsaw were matured long ago. These had been worked out in detail with General Berling's Polish army and General Rola-Zimierski's forces in eastern occupied Poland. Though there is no desire to underappreciate the gallantry of the people of Warsaw, the revolt is considered here to have gone off at half-cock and to have been a costly and avoidable failure with many puzzling features. So as you say, you can see the communist authorities in Moscow, they're distancing themselves very, very obviously from the rising in Warsaw.
Is anyone else as infuriated as I am? Because as you're reading that, Roger, it's just raised my blood pressure all the way up. The Moscow's just reacting to all of this so flippantly.
Well, of course, I mean, this is in the context of the Russians not allowing the Allied air forces to use the bases that they have got in occupied territory in the east of Poland to refuel and not allowing them to fly over their airspace. And when they capture down pilots, they don't put them back into action, but they send them to Moscow. So in effect, they are reducing the number of aircraft that can deliver supplies to Warsaw. And of course, their armed forces are now waiting. They're encamped on the far side, on the eastern side of the Vistula, waiting for this, basically for the Warsaw Uprising to fail, and doing all they can to hasten that failure while distancing themselves from it. So yes, this is not an impartial commentary.
Of course, this being Warsaw in 1944, there's bound to be some atrocities carried out by the Germans at this point. What have you got on that, Alina?
There's not an atrocity per se in the direct extermination or execution of people, but the Germans on this day cut off the water supply to the whole city, which brings absolute chaos. People have no access to fresh water, to be able to drink, to bathe, to cook, nothing of the sort. So Colonel Antoni Khrushchev basically gives the order for people to start saving water. They have to start digging wells and basically try to conserve it.
Speaking of the Germans, there's the entry for this day in the German 9th Army combat log was as follows.
In Warsaw, the attack towards the Kiebitz Bridge is now underway. A large number of airdrops were taken over by our troops. ROK 9, definitively regulates the command over troops introduced from outside to the operations in Warsaw. SS Gruppenführer von den Bach. All units and commands used to combat the uprising, including the commander of the Wehrmacht in Warsaw, are subordinated to Bach without any restrictions. The Führer entrusted von den Bach with crushing the uprising.
Thank you so much for listening to day 14, and we will see you tomorrow for day 15. Remember, if you liked this episode, make sure you head to your preferred listening platform to give us a 5-star rating. Thank you so much.